Hélène Molinierek baieztatu du emakumearen egoerari buruzko batzordearen lanare zati handi batek teknologiari eta generoari buruzko uste okerrak deusestatzen lagundu duela. Badako digu, informazio gehiago daukagu, ez gaitu ez zera kaso harritzen, baino joko arau berriak ezartzen laguntzen digu, beste beste. Tresna eta zerbitzu digitalen erabilera areagotu egin behar da, bai, baino beti esaten dugun bezala sortzaileak ere izan behar dugu horretan. Entre las conclusiones de la Comisión de la Condición Jurídica y Social de la Mujer, recalcar que no existe un tipo singular y universal de brecha digital de género, sino una confluencia de brechas, que depende también de cada país. Lo digo porque a veces también nosotras, depende quiénes, podemos tener sesgos étnicos y tenemos que recordar que entre nosotras también somos diversas. Los programas, además, se centran en arreglar a las mujeres. Vaya, no, si no necesitamos que nos arreglen, con que no nos rompan, vamos de calle. También se ha constatado que la digitalización y la innovación son un igualador de oportunidades. Por lo tanto, esta es una gran noticia. Tenemos que seguir trabajando en este camino. Y el cambio de paradigma exige una remodelación completa de nuestros ecosistemas tecnológicos y de innovación. Por supuesto, con responsabilidades compartidas y esfuerzos también compartidos. Y llegadas a este punto, es importante recordar que la perspectiva de género no solo se limita a estudiar a las mujeres, también estudia a los hombres, que a veces se nos olvida con todo esto de hablar de género, parece que al final todo se centra en nosotras y es en la relación y los contextos en los que nos movemos. Pero ¿qué sucede en el contexto de la investigación? ¿Cómo se puede incorporar esta perspectiva de género? Tengamos en cuenta que esto implica revisar históricamente toda también la literatura científica escrita hasta ahora. ¿Desde dónde? ¿Quién la ha escrito? Y cómo la ha escrito. De hecho, la recopilación de datos, ayer también lo decía la profesora Schivinger, lo importante que es la interseccionalidad en todo esto. Galdera asko eta aukera oraindik gehiago. Datorren mai inguruak genero ikuspegia ikerketan txertatzea izenburupean, honen guzti honen inguruan solastuko du. Eta moderatzeko, plazerra da gurekin Amaia Eskisabel izatea, Eusko Jaurlaritzako Hezkuntza Saileko ikerketa zuzendaria. Txalo bero bat berarentzat, mesedez.
Good morning, everyone. Thank you so much, Maitena. As it just was said, I'm a Director of Research at the Department of Education of the Basque Government, and I will be speaking in Spanish. And beyond being a researcher, I'm also a professor and researcher in pharmaceutical technology in the University of the Basque Country. So before starting to work with in the Basque government, I've developed my career as a researcher, and this has been acknowledged through the program of professors and through different programs and through the quality agency for the Basque University. And beyond that, I've also worked as a traditional researcher with a stash in Canada, UK, Norway, published more than 30 scientific papers and worked on different international theses. I have 2 patents and collaborated in more than 30 research projects in the Basque Country, Spain, and Europe, and participated in 10 contracts on the transfer of know-how with pharmaceutical companies. Beyond that, I've also participated in management as coordinator of educational services in the University of the Basque Country for 5 years. So this is what I did in the past. And now, as research director, we coordinate what is happening in the Basque Country, and we promote and coordinate research programs, designing the adequate instruments for the execution of these programs, and fostering human resources, and including ICER-Basque that was created by the Basque government 17 years ago. And also we work on programs for scientific and technological infrastructures, promoting measures so that the Basque scientific community complies with the excellence required worldwide, and being able to respond to the challenges that we face locally but also internationally. We develop different activities, but in this forum, I would like to highlight some good practices, some of them linked to what we are addressing today in the roundtable. Unfortunately, I couldn't be here for the whole day yesterday, but yesterday and today I've heard about STEM education. We need to, as different stakeholders and agents, act for the situation to improve. We do not face equality. There's no gender equality, neither in science, technology, nor research. But together, we need to progress towards that equality, even though it will take some time. Therefore, in 2018, we put in place a STEAM strategy led by the Education Department and coordinated by the Deputy Regional Ministry of Research. And I'm not going to go into further detail, but one of the targets of this strategy is to promote scientific and technical vocations amongst the youth and citizens, and especially focusing in young women and girls. Therefore, we've developed different projects in collaboration with different stakeholders of the business sphere and technology sphere that have an impact in schools and education. And also, I have a positive message with me today, even though there's many things to still be done to achieve the desired equality. But I would also like to highlight that since the start of the strategy in 2018, we've increased in 3 points the registration of young women in STEM studies, which include also our arts and humanities, which is important for the development of STEM. So we have increased, as I said before, in 3 points. So we are 1.5 points over the European average and also over the average in Spain. As I talked about ICER-Basque before, that we launched 16 years ago. The scientific director, Fernando Cosio, was with us yesterday. The first scientific director was a woman, Mari Carmen Berastegui. And in ICER-Basque, we monitor indicators of the situation of science in the Basque Country, including also the situation of women and science, and Fernando talked about this yesterday. And today I would also like to highlight how we, 4 years ago, started to acknowledge the career of women researchers in the different stages. Because always when we give an award, it's always at the end of your career, someone with a consolidated background, but we don't recognize the work, and we don't have any models or examples for young girls that can see that researchers are normal people that you can run into in the elevator in your home. So that's why we've wanted to recognize the work of those that are starting to work as researchers, those that are seniors, and those that are in between. And one of the other things we're doing from our DG is to work on with research groups, something that we will address in the roundtable, and that is how to improve gender perspective in research. And one of the issues that we will address is the participation of women and men, and also leadership. We have an important tender for research groups in the Basque country, and we monitor it, and of course it can be improved, and gender issues have already been included, but we've also included measures to increase the leadership of women in these research groups, and also put in place measures to have a good collaboration of generations and to reflect on the sustainability model. So there's a good handover between generations. And as I mentioned before, we're not in a situation of equality, but we've gone from a 27% of groups led by women to a 37% of groups led by women. So this is a starting point, and now we will start with the panel session with 3 experts in gender equality that can give us their vision of how to incorporate gender vision. We will start with Curt Rice, who is an expert from the Norway's Committee on Gender Balance and Diversity in Research.
Curt Rice. He currently leads the Norway Committee on Gender Balance and Diversity in Research. Besides that, he has also been the head of the board for current research information system in Norway called Kristin until 2016. Curt Rice has been involved in several European projects on gender equality, including the GenSet project, which started the conference's Gender Summit. Rice has served in several leadership roles at Norwegian universities, including being vice rector for research at the University of Tromsø and main rector at Oslo Metropolitan University and also at the Norwegian University of Life Sciences and at the Oslo and Akershus University College of Applied Sciences. He speaks widely on gender equality issues and is excited to participate in the Generation Equality Forum. Professor Rice, it's a pleasure to have you here today. Be welcome, and the floor is yours.
Good morning, everyone. Such a pleasure to be here today and to be part of this international conference. And I'd like to allow myself, since it is an international conference, to take this opportunity to thank the interpreters that have made it possible for me and others to participate. I know you've been working very hard, and I appreciate your efforts very much. Like many of you here, I have spent my career at universities, and I just love the idea of a university. I really believe that universities and education are absolutely central in all of our attempts to move society forward. And I'd like to say a few more words about that and how I think it connects to the topic that we're spending these 2 days discussing. What is it that actually happens at a university? Right? What's the core mission of a university? Sometimes we say it's about doing research. Sometimes we say it's about doing education. I think those things can be brought together around a very specific topic, which is the topic of discovery. The business that we're engaged in at universities is about discovering things. I mean, that's actually like the definition of research, right? You go in to a laboratory or to a book and you have some question and you figure something out that nobody knew before. You actually discover something on behalf of humanity. Now, how cool is that? You know, every single day at a university, somebody discovers something that nobody knew before. And if you think about education, education is also an enterprise about discovery. Maybe not for humanity as a whole, but for an individual instead. As a teacher, I hope every day that a student who comes into my classroom leaves that classroom knowing something that they didn't know before. I hope that they leave that classroom having experienced discovery. So whether we're doing research or whether we're doing education, the heart of daily life, the soul of daily life at universities is about discovery. How could you not want to be part of that, right? That's such an exciting, cool, incredible experience. Now, there are other kinds of institutions that do research in industry and in lots of places. And there are other kinds of institutions that do education. But universities are the only place that bring those together. And when we're at our best, we engage in research-based education. We bring together the discovery that we made yesterday in the laboratory into the classroom and let students have that experience for themselves of learning something new. But this task of working on behalf of society to create the circumstances for discovery, that is a task that brings with it many responsibilities. And I think that the focus of this conference is exactly about some of those important responsibilities. The task of implementing societal responsibilities for what universities do is a task that falls on the leadership of those universities. And I specifically wanted to refer to part of the title of this conference, the last part of the title, where it says, "For a Paradigm Shift." And we've talked a lot the last couple of days about equality, about science, about technology. What are we thinking about when we say that something is for a paradigm shift? That's an extremely ambitious goal. And I want to encourage those of you who are working hands-on with this project to think very carefully about what you mean by that. What do you mean when you say we're working for a paradigm shift? And why is that important? Those are questions that those of you in these projects have to have good answers for, and I think there are good answers for them. We know that a paradigm shift is important for all the kinds of reasons that we've heard about in these brilliant keynotes that we've had yesterday and today, and at the workshops. I won't go through those again, but we know that the work we're doing right here today is about improving the conditions for health care for everyone, for economic growth for everyone, for the use of technology for everyone. So it's not hard for those of us who are in this room to understand the need for a paradigm shift, but that will not happen without people in leadership positions understanding their role. And so part of what we have to do is we have to get access to people in leadership positions, and we have to target them, and we have to convince them of the importance of this work. That is not always easy. Sometimes we need carrots, sometimes we need sticks, but carrots, I think, usually work better. We get a lot of help from the European Commission, for example, through the Horizon regulations. As you all know, these now require gender equality plans. If you go to the president of a university and say, your researchers cannot apply for money from the Horizon program unless your university has a gender equality plan, that kind of thing works. That's really effective, right? No university president will want to hear from his or her minister that, hey, what's going on here? Why aren't you getting money from Europe? And then have to say, well, because we couldn't be bothered to make a gender equality plan, right? So that's important. And many national and regional research councils have been inspired by the decision of the European Commission, and they also have these requirements, and that, again, is something that not everybody knows, even now a few years into it. So we have to be careful about that. We can talk to people in leadership positions and try to trigger their sense of competition. For example, you want your university to deliver as good as possible to society. You want to have a reputation in your region of attracting the best people that you can. Part of that depends on the work culture that you have, and part of that creates the circumstances for better gender equality, and the other way around. Better gender equality creates better working conditions for everyone. Maybe you want to appeal to the sense of competition of somebody in a leadership position by saying, don't you want your university to be the very best in our country when it comes to the number of women professors that we have, for example? And especially in institutions where there are men at the top, maybe they're triggered by that kind of competition. I don't know. We heard yesterday that men are more competitive than women. I don't know. I'd like to just conclude here and leave some time for a discussion by saying this. Achieving a better understanding of equality and science and technology is something that we as researchers can do. That's something we can do with our students. But achieving a paradigm shift is going to be really an uphill battle if we don't have the people in, well, it's going to be an uphill battle anyway, but if we don't have the people in leadership with us, it's going to be an even steeper hill that we have to climb, and much, much more is possible. And I want to say to those of you who are working on this project, you must have a plan, a project, a sub-project for how to get in contact with people in leadership positions, how to influence them, and then how to use them to target policymakers. And there may be deep cultural issues that have to be faced here. I'll just conclude by sharing with you an experience I had yesterday. I had the privilege of speaking with a journalist from a local newspaper here, and the questions that I was asked did not make me particularly optimistic regarding the work of gender equality, or maybe it did, because it made it so easy to identify what has to be done. So that journalist opened our interview by asking me, do women hate science, or does science hate women? And I thought to myself, wow, that is a question from another era. But maybe it's not. Maybe that is a sign of cultural challenges that have to be faced. Maybe that's the kind of thing that tells us exactly why it's so important to have a project focused on a paradigm shift. And I want to emphasize to you that an absolutely crucial part of that process is getting the support of leadership. Thank you for your attention. I think I put my contact information right there. So I love to talk about this stuff. So send me a note, and I'll be happy to talk about it more.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Professor Rice, for your interesting speech. Tenemos ahora a Paloma González.
Now we have with us Paloma González, a professor from the Autonomous University of Barcelona. She's worked on the research of prehistory and in the Mediterranean area from the Neolithic age to the Iron Age. She's focused on working on archaeology and the development of different research technologies to study spaces, and also looking at the domestic space in this different archaeology missions, always taking into account gender perspective. She's coordinated different European projects like the Pyrenees route for rural innovation and heritage. She now works on the Cultural Memories project for creative culture.
Past Women.
She's worked on the project Past Women, looking into the language of objects, that was funded by the Women's Institute. and looking into the material history of women and its dissemination that was funded by the Women's Institute in Catalonia. She is also the coordinator of the Past Women Group, that is a collaborative network of professionals in archaeology, history, education, museums, and cultural heritage, renowned from 2019 as one of the thematic networks that they consider. So thank you, Professor González. You have the floor.
Primero, quiero agradecer a la organización.
First of all, I would like to thank the organization for being courageous enough to invite an expert in prehistory when we are speaking about science and technology, because apparently it could seem to be a contradiction when it really isn't, or at least that's how I see it, and the organization too, so thank you. When I find myself in this kind of situations, I've always prepared my presentation, but after listening to others, I have changed my presentation. But first of all, I would like to go back to what Dr. Rice just mentioned and was mentioned at the presentation today. When we speak about all these strategies, plans, and challenges, and then at one point we always add or mention deeper cultural stereotypes as an element that conditions the rest of the narrative and actions. So this is very adequate for me, because if this cultural stereotypes, the deepest cultural stereotypes and hurdles are what I look into when looking at prehistory, and that's my starting point. The organization offered me the possibility of having a PowerPoint, but archaeology and prehistory are very photogenic, and I could have brought something, but unfortunately you will just have to listen to my words. I don't have a PowerPoint with me. There's no visual reference, and I decided not to do so because my first image to speak about gender stereotypes in prehistory and the gender perspective in archaeology and prehistory would have to be an image of Indiana Jones, and I thought it wasn't very adequate in such a context. And in fact, it's Indiana Jones due to specific reasons, because somehow Indiana Jones represents the cultural stereotypes that are so rooted and linked to the practice of research, as well as to the targets of research. In the case of prehistory and in general terms in archaeology, because we share methodology and objectives, archaeology and prehistory are disciplines that are highly masculine, with a culture that somehow represents the clear stereotype that we find in our society. And that's why Indiana Jones is so well known and recognized. And in fact, it's not only a male in its practice, and the research practice, but also in its objectives. If we look back into Indiana Jones, he's interested in elements that have to do with power, wealth, and is very far away from looking into the relationships and the lives of the people that lived in the past. In the case of prehistory, when I was asked to participate today, the title was, how has a gender perspective influenced your career and your profession? Well, I must add that it's very adequate for Dr. Rice to be here, because the first researchers in archaeology and prehistory that talked about gender inequality when analyzing prehistory and archaeology were in fact Norwegian researchers that were linked to the Stavanger Museum, and that in the 70s already asked in a meeting, they organized a small conference meeting, asking themselves, were we all men in the past? because really, and this is an element that me and my colleagues from the Past Women Network is something we try and look into, not only in our university work, but also outside it, because this is one of the basic arguments in prehistory and archaeology, because we find invisibility not only of women, but of the persons beyond the stereotypes we're all used to. In fact, in the last years, when these contributions get to the media, for example, regarding women, gender, and prehistory, most of you will probably remember that it was discovered that, for example, women would hunt or be wealthy in prehistory. So those things that surprise us because they are linked to this enrooted cultural stereotypes don't allow us to see that women also hunted or could be powerful, as well as there were women, there were also different people outside the norm in our imagery. So, from this first question that was asked by the Norwegian researchers at the time, I believe that in archaeology and prehistory, there has been a very deep look into these two elements. We say, okay, we have the capacity from this past times to challenge cultural stereotypes that are now present in a mainstream manner in all actions. On many occasions, we are aware, and public policies also reflect this, because even when implementing strategies that have to do with inclusion and equality, there is this element of making natural specific roles, or there's an unequal distribution of skills. And these prototypes or archetypes sometimes can only be challenged through research, knowledge, and also I would like to quote once again what has been said before, from the sphere of education. And this is our perspective when working on this. There's another element that is also important, and that's not only the narrative or the story that comes from prehistory and that can change fundamental elements in this way of seeing the past and what we are and what we were as women and men. But there's also this other element that we believe is very interesting, and that is also included and being developed by researchers, women archaeologists, and women experts, and is the context of anthrocentric research that is also on some occasions abusive.
In the case of archaeology and the research of archaeology, we have been analyzing the context of field work. In archaeology, for example, we see that there's a great deal of inequality in the field work. In this field of archaeology, we see that some women sometimes quit the teams because they feel discriminated. And we see in many disciplines that this happens. And particularly in the world of archaeology, we see great inequality. And that's a field in which we need to reshape the narrative. I don't know how I'm doing on time. Can I continue a bit longer? Thank you. I'd also like to say, regarding my discipline, that something that can be applicable to all lines of research and all other disciplines. We see in prehistory some cases in which a need has become a virtue. In other words, some apparent inequalities that placed women in a position of inferiority have in the end turned out to be positive. Let me explain myself further. In archaeology and prehistory, During the 80s, there was an American researcher, a pioneer in the field of gender equality in anthropology. And this American researcher wrote a paper called Archaeology and Ideology of Women at Home. And in this paper, in this research, she said that now that women access universities in the Western world and also access archaeology and anthropology studies, we see that there is a division of chores or of tasks, meaning that our male researchers would go out to do field work, whereas women would remain in the lab doing minor tasks. And this reminded us of, the situation in the household. And there are some studies that confirm this division of tasks between men and women. And now we see that thanks to the fact that we've given visibility to this division of tasks, the situation is changing. Now we see in archaeology that there are many women involved in field work. We see that there are many women not only out in the field but also in the lab doing biogenetic research. And we see that many times now it's women who are taking the lead. Perhaps this is the result of the fact that in the past they were left, playing a secondary role. And now what we see is a change in leadership. We see that women are taking the lead in many very important research projects. For example, we see this in some European projects like the SRC. We see that the situation has changed. So from these past flaws, now we have new virtues or new wonders. And women are now enjoying the position they deserve. And now, at this point, I'd like to finish with some conclusions. Based on the analysis of my discipline, I believe that we need to also reflect on the link between humanities and the new disciplines, the new technologies. It's very important that we revisit humanities. This will help us understand those profound stereotypes that continue to shape the narrative. It's very important that we build bridges between the different disciplines. I'd also like to highlight the importance of collaborative work. If we want to mainstream these new perspectives, we need to forge alliances among women, women that support each other, that act as mentors or as mentees. That is very important. Yesterday, we were talking about the importance of mentoring. And we see that in the world of research, in the discipline of heritage, we have many women researchers collaborating in mentoring programs, and this has given way to new projects, to new ideas, and this has helped to empower women. Now we see that gender perspectives are more mainstreamed thanks to mentoring programs as well. That's all I wanted to share with you for now. Thanks very much for the time you've given me. Thanks very much, Paloma, for your insights. And now we enjoy the presence of Elena Aldasoro, who holds a PhD in preventive medicine and public health, and she holds a master's in clinical research and epidemiology. Elena has conducted her work in the field of research and planning in health, and she currently works at the Public Health and Addictions Department of the Health Division of the Basque Government. Madam Aldasoro has analyzed inequalities in access to health care. She's analyzed the gender factor. And more recently, she has researched addictions. And as regards gender, she has researched the elements that determine gender inequalities in healthcare and acute myocardial infarction. She has also talked about inequalities in the screening and detection of colorectal cancer. And she's also analyzed the dissemination of research with a gender perspective. She collaborates with Aditec from Navarre. Elena contributes to scientific excellence. She brings on board the gender perspective as a cross-sectional perspective. And she has participated in shaping the more recent public health and prevention policies of the Basque government. Welcome, Madam Aldasoro. It's our pleasure to enjoy your presence here today, Madam. Good morning. Thanks very much. Well, I have brought some slides myself. I'm going to show you some practical examples to try to get my message across so that you understand how in the field of health it is very important to bring on the gender and sex perspective. This first slide I had decided to eliminate, but in the last minute I decided to bring it back again. It represents women in bikini, and this belongs to a collection of mosaics in a Roman villa in Sicily. If you visit Sicily, please visit this El Casale Villa that represents sportswomen, happy, playing, well-fed, well-nourished. And when I see this, I think of old films or the full albums of our great-grandmothers. And I believe that we've we haven't been able to make much headway. We see that we women have suffered inferiority up until the 60s or 70s. We didn't start using bikinis in Europe, but these women, probably from the high class from the year 300, were already using bikinis. When we talk about the gender perspective in health, we need to consider two elements. On the one hand, we need to consider the gender perspective in research, i.e. in the generation of knowledge, which is then going to translate into public health policies and healthcare to avoid healthcare biases based on gender. And we also need to consider the equality of opportunities of the people that participate in research itself. In the world of health and medicine, it's very important to make a distinction between these two terms. Of course, there's a heated discussion on these two terms, but in medicine, it's very important that we make a distinction between the biological differences between men and women that are not changeable, and then we have the gender-based differences that are built socially and that have to do with the roles and responsibilities assigned to the different genders and that position men and women differently, both within the household and beyond. And this has consequences also on healthcare. And since this is a social construct, it changes through time and through communities and regions. As regards sex differences, we see that the size of bodily organs is smaller in men, and men are weaker genetically. And this is one of the reasons why there are 6 years of difference in life expectancy between men and women. And 3 years of these differences could be attributed to this that I was mentioning, to the size of the bodily organs. And the other 3 years are related to masculinity and the habits of men who tend to assume greater risks and are less, in touch with preventive habits. And when we talk about gender, let me refer to the deformation of feet of women that used to wear bandages to avoid the growth of their feet, and the use of psycho drugs. And for example, in the Basque Country, until we have reached 10 years of age, a young boy has 4 times the likeliness of taking drugs to address TDAH. For example, attention deficit and hyperactivity disorder drugs. We see that young girls take less drugs than young men. In the case of health, it's very important to make the distinction, I insist, between sex and gender. And in medicine, we also need to make a distinction between what's typical and what's atypical, because what's expected is considered to be typical, and what's expected is what's more associated to the male pattern, and what's unexpected is considered or deemed to be atypical. And this has a great impact on how we're going to be looked after by the health care systems. Those that know me well will think that I always insist in acute myocardial infarction. But this is a very good example that helps us understand the gender inequalities. This is a research that was done at a state level that wanted to look into the incidence, i.e. each the number of new cases and the mortality and the treatment of AMI. The initial design was not to disaggregate by sex. So if we have in this sample all people between 25 years of age and 74 years of age, when we did the analysis, we understood that we only had 18% of women in this sample. And we weren't disaggregating by sex, so we were generating knowledge of what happened in men and not in women. And we didn't have significant, inadequate representation of women. We have reviewed literature, and thankfully there are more and more scientific papers in medicine on disabilities and differences in healthcare outcomes. And I've been working hard with the documentalist of the health department. And we are trying to improve searches to make searches gender sensitive. And now we've repeated this research, this study, and we've recruited or enrolled 30% women. And what we've understood is that although acute myocardial infarction is less frequent in men, once women have an AMI, mortality is much greater in women, as opposed to men. And when we analyze the treatment, we saw that the treatment of choice, which is to revascularize the artery, and the first hour of intervention is key. Well, we saw that in women, this kind of treatment was delayed in time, thus the higher mortality. And we saw that the time it takes to receive health care changes depending on whether you're a woman or a man. We realized it took longer for women to receive early treatment, prompt treatment, and this bias in care was related to sex factors. Why? Well, because this happens to women at an older age, and we as women have more atypical signs. We have more comorbidities and hypertension. But as regards gender-related factors, the perception of risk is different. We as women sometimes do not foresee the risk. And the healthcare practitioners, and they don't like me saying this, but this actually happens. The thing is that when women go, feeling, breast or chest pain, if you're a woman, you don't have an electrocardiogram done. You're giving a painkiller. And we, experts in care in health, understood that there's a difference in approach. And we, as women, tend to be also carers. We tend to endure pain more. And sometimes, women's pain is rendered invisible. And in the case of acute myocardial infarction, we see that in women, the symptoms are not as acute. The acute pain in the jaw is not as significant as in the case of men, and this leads to a later intervention on behalf of the health practitioners. And there are other diseases in which we have identified differences. I like to follow the work done by Alison McGregor. Alison McGregor is a doctor who works in the ER. She makes, decisions in the ER life-death decisions, and she has been working together with another author, and they coined the concept of the gentle syndrome that is based on a Barbara Streisand film, who was a woman Jew that had to dress up as a man to study the Holy Scriptures. And this means to say that when we as women look as a man, we're treated well, but when we are differentiated, we benefit less from therapeutical progress. And she says that the price for being similar to men is being more similar to men. Anyhow. The gentle syndrome, extremely interesting. Look into it. I could talk about this for hours and hours, so don't hesitate to jump in, dear chair. In the U.S., in any case, there are many units that are trying to bridge the difference in treatment. This study, the WISE study, analyzes AMI. That's the coronary artery. What happens in the case of men? Before the AMI, there is a narrowing of the artery. It's very abrupt, as you can see, whereas in the case of females, this narrowing is more constant, as you can see in the lower part of the slide. And that's why, if you analyze the artery and the flow, in the case of men, there's an abrupt interruption of blood flow that leads to more acute symptoms, whereas in the case of women, we see a greater constant, a less abrupt obstruction, and that's why the symptoms are more silent. And the typical technique are, well, of course, catheterization. And what we see is that in the case of women, the intervention always happens at a later stage. And it's true that our arteries are narrower, placing sometimes the stents in women arrives later on. And we also need to adapt the technology and the devices we use to the physical features, the physical characteristics of women. And why are women invisible? Well, because what we've done is what I call bikini medicine. Our reproductive organs have been extensively studied, but not other bodily organs. And we as women and as our women bodies haven't been studied as extensively as male bodies. In 2010, Nature published a study saying that we had to put gender on the agenda. It said that biomedic research continues using more male subjects in both animal studies and human-based studies. Much more male subjects than female subjects. There is less evidence-based medicine using women. And what happens when you leave women out of the sample? For example, one of the consequences is that there's a greater number of secondary or side effects in women and when taking drugs. Zolpidem, for example, is a drug that is used to combat sleep disorders. And we've been able to see that the side effects of zolpidem in women are much greater than in men. Of course, we also need to make a distinction in the doses for men and women. In 2014, the U.S. research bodies promoted a policy to make sure that preclinical research considers the inclusion of both sexes, both in animal-based studies and human studies. This is something that was decided or promoted since 2010. And it's true that some headway has been done, but it's being slow, and it's taken quite a lot of time to change the methods and the research culture. And every cell has a sex, as we often say. The cells of the lungs, of liver, of men and women are different. And in Canada, for example, they're studying the sex of cells, and they say that every cell has a sex, and that we and that therefore there are key differences. And when we talk about intersectionality, we not only need to consider sex, but also age. There's an age bias. We see that drugs are tested in middle-aged men, and then these drugs are being used by elderly women. This was a conclusion of the researcher. The problem is that we, in the clinical trials, are not selecting the samples appropriately. And in this slide, you can see a gender bias in the decision making. And one of the aspects of value-based healthcare establishes that decisions need to be made jointly by practitioners and patients, i.e., that we have to bring patients on board of the decision-making process. There was a study that was carried out to see for prostate cancer and how many instances we had shared decision making, and then we also analyzed this for uterine cancer, and we saw that in the case of uterine or cervix cancer, the decision making was not as much as a shared process. And here we have Mileva Marek, Einstein's wife. She was rendered invisible by her husband. The letters have been declassified recently. It's very interesting what she contributed herself. And I'd like to finish off by referring to the film Oppenheimer. And I'd like to highlight the role of the women behind the Manhattan Project. The director of this film didn't showcase the contribution of women. And we also need to consider the academic gap in the pandemic. We saw that male researchers published more papers during lockdown, whereas researchers were more, focusing on care and household chores. And we saw that during the pandemic, most of the experts, that were interviewed online and in the press were men instead of women experts. It's really a pity how in times of crisis we will once again, make the same mistakes. Here you can see the panel of experts making decisions during the pandemic. And I'd like to show you this tweet. There was a flooding in the Basque Country, and there was this tweet that said there was actually a woman in the crisis cabinet of the Basque Country. And then I'd also like to say that women self-reference themselves much more than women. And I'll finish now, because as you can see, I had brought, a wealth of slides, but I don't have time to cover them all. Thank you.
Bueno, quería también con...
And I'd like to pay tribute to Marta Macho, Women in Science. Thanks very much, Elena. I really hate to interrupt you, but this leaves some time for the Q&A. Before I give the floor to the audience, well, first I'd like to thank you and congratulate you for your very insightful presentations. And we've seen, in your case, there you go, we've seen how we can mainstream gender in the design of a research study or in a clinical trial. You've given us a clear example of the advantages of mainstreaming the gender factor when studying some specific diseases. Paloma has explained the gender perspective in the content of research, and Curt has provided us with a very interesting broader vision. And in the audience, we have researchers from different fields of knowledge, because one may think that in health, it's very clear in the design how you can bring on board the gender perspective, or it's clearer, and that we need to bring on board both female and male animals and humans. But in other fields, for example, in physics, in engineering, or when designing drugs and medicines, in these cases, what pieces of advice, general pieces of advice, could you give the audience so that when they select content, so that when they design, or from a broader perspective, they can apply the takeaways of the roundtable? What pieces of advice would you give them? I'd like to share a piece of advice, or not perhaps a tip or an advice, but a reflection. I'm a chair, a tenured professor, and it would be inappropriate to give you a specific piece of advice for other disciplines. But in general, I would advise you to include women in teamwork, to have mixed teams. We need to bring on board the gaze of both men and women. Only this way will we be able to address the different issues. And we also need to consider diversity. The fact that we have diversity in the teams is very important. It's then when the methodology needs to bring on diversity, and that's key for me. We need to avoid this idea of having, researchers working on their own, or researchers need to work as a team with a representation of both sexes, and this promotes equality and cross-sectionality.
Sorry, I'm listening to the interpreters. Well, one thing that occurs to me as I listen to my esteemed colleagues is that we use this phrase, the gender perspective, to mean the woman's perspective. And I think that one thing that is important to increase the attention that science pays to men and women biologically and in the cultural domain as well. One thing that's important is to get men to also take ownership of this agenda. And that's a difficult challenge, or it's a challenge that you have to approach explicitly. So it seems very unfair to give women as a group responsibility for making sure that all of us are doing work of a higher quality because it properly represents the full specter of humanity. So I would like to support these efforts to have gender perspectives on research questions and gender balance in research groups and so on. But I would like to find ways, look at the audience. How many, can the men raise their hands? Yeah, well, you know what? It's not bad. It's not bad for a gender conference, because it's often, one or two. But I think one of the things that we have to work together to do is to get men to understand that this is not a feminist issue only. It is an issue about quality in the results of scientific work, and if they're not interested in that, they need to find something else to do.
Thank you. Elena, ¿querías añadir algo?
Bueno, lo fundamental es lo que han venido diciendo.
Yes, I completely agree with what has been said. Yes, we need to bring men on board. We need to ensure due representation of both men and women. We need to value the work of both equally. And of course, it's very important that we lay down the groundwork or the conditions so that those research projects can be run appropriately. For example, I was acting as an advisor for this project conducted in Navarre. This is a research project that is developing a vaccine for breast cancer with a poor diagnosis. It was a meeting scheduled between 3 and 7 p.m. and I had to intervene last. And at the beginning, we had 16, women participating online. And at 7 p.m., we had a more limited representation. It was me, 5 men, and another lady. At the beginning, we had many women, but after 5, well, they had to dial out from the call. They apologized, but they had, other responsibilities. So for us to be in those teams on equal terms, we need to make sure that the design is appropriate, that all these factors are considered.
Sí, pero bueno.
Totalmente de acuerdo, Paloma.
Sí, yo quería apuntar también en...
Paloma? Yes, I would like to go back to what Elena was saying. It's not only meetings, it's also attendance to conferences, when you go abroad, which allows you to progress not only in your CV, but also in your knowledge. And therefore, universities and research centers have a very important role when they can offer services to provide support, childcare, financial compensation. In fact, we were very successful at our university, and we're very pleased with this, because in an exchange Erasmus program, monoparental families could have a budget for childcare of children that stayed or that they wanted to bring with them. And we made this part of the European budget, but we had problems to implement it at the university because they didn't have an accounting category where they could include it. So this is something, an issue. When we talk about life-work balance, it has to be considered in the broadest of senses. Because there's families, women that don't go to different places because they cannot pay for it, which also increases the inequality, and also age, because when you have to develop yourself as a researcher, it's usually the time when you're having children. So let's make this contracts and this subsidies to also scholarships to take this into account. Yes, in the Basque Country, for example, there's a PhD scholarships and so on and so forth. And if you have to stop because of you're having children, then you can take it or later on. And also with the leaves, usually it's moms that have to stop their activity because they take more leaves when they have children. So in our case, we had one more year to delay that activity if they want to. In the case of mobility, we also have additional covering of expenses so that they can also move with their families, with insurance and so on and so forth. So we put in place many basic measures that we believe are helping, and we would like to incorporate more to make this easier for women in research. Yeah. So that's why you have an increase in women researchers? Well, probably it's related, but at the end of the day, this is something that has to do with society as a whole, and also families have a very important role to play. But to have the specific political conditions that are supporting and also taking into account the decrease of research activity because of maternity is something that is helping us, and is helping them promote in a better manner and to have more women. It's not only women with us, and I believe Fernando mentioned this. Fernando Cosio talked about this yearly report, and in the yearly report, we include an item that is women in science. And when we look at women in research, we're over the average. And in fact, we have more women in PhD programs than men. And 56% of the beneficiaries are women, and they are usually have better results. In the PhD program, we have around 70% of women that also continue in research. The problem is the valley of death that happens when having a stable position and being mothers. And this is hard for women and both men to have a permanent position. But in the case of women, it's even a more difficult situation, because usually it's at the same time in which you're asking yourself if you want to be a mother or not. So if the system, your partner, your family, and scientific policy and the center's policy specifically is not helping you to take this decision, so many of them leave. We've carried out a study, or more than a study, is a look into what is happening with PhD women students and if they get a permanent position, which is fundamental because this later on nourishes teams to make them mainstream and so on and so forth. Because if you don't have the possibility of working in science, you won't be able to achieve anything. So there's two issues to bear in mind. One of them is the scholarships and the subsidies for life-work balance. But then also there's a difference in assessment too. The idea of I'm capable of. Young women or women that are not so young because they've already done their PhD usually tend to say, well, maybe I don't have the capacity. Yes, they have the imposter syndrome. Yes, that's it. So this is something that is very present, and we go back to the cultural stereotypes that were I was mentioning before. It's not only the material conditions, but also the context and how we see things and how we see ourselves as women regarding our capabilities.
Very quick example from Norway that I think illustrates nicely how policy can introduce cultural change, and that is related to this issue about parental leave of absence, where also in Norway you have approximately 1 year, let's say, and now 14 weeks must be taken by the father. And at the beginning, when that was introduced, maybe, I don't know, 6 or 8 years ago, everybody said, oh, they can't go away for 14 weeks, our business will collapse and everything will go, it will be terrible. And now today, nobody even talks about it. It's just normal. It's, men actually want to be fathers also, and they want to have that time with their child. Now, it does mean some time is reduced for the mothers, so the mothers have to also welcome that, and that's something we can discuss too. But my point is simply that by getting a political decision, by making a policy change, in a relatively short amount of time, you get a cultural change that follows that, and it just becomes normal, and nobody even thinks about it. So there is hope.
Thank you. Creo que es tiempo para dar
I think it's now time after this comment to listen to the audience. Are there any questions from the audience? Thank you. Thank you so much for your presentations. I have a question for Paloma González, but before that, I would like to mention the guides to introduce gender perspective that are in Catalonia and that have also been translated to Spanish and that are applied to all knowledge areas. So in the European project that I was able to coordinate, there's a handbook by Oxford Brook with good practices to introduce gender perspective. And in the Deusto University, we also have a handbook for gender perspective in education. And when we talk about this, we go back to what you were saying regarding interrelationship in teams and how to apply this regarding content. So there is a checklist that is quite comprehensive. The guide is, you can check it online and download it for free, and you can find it in Basque, Spanish, and English. So this was my marketing. But these three tools, the Sachas Vivas guide, the handbook, and our guide are all three very useful. And my question for Paloma González. I think this is something very interesting, and I always say that how prehistory studies bring us back to how women would go to war, hunt, and so on and so forth. So my question is the following. these new arguments come from new discoveries or from a new way of looking to previous discoveries? So are there been discoveries that have shed light on things, or finally we're wearing the purple glasses and we can see information that was there and reinterpreted with a gender perspective? Well, first of all, that's a very good question. Yes, the information was already there. Those women of us working in prehistory know that women hunt, go to war, and are part of society. So it wasn't something that we suddenly discovered, oh, they did hunt. No. But what's true is that society demands that we can demonstrate that women did certain things in the past. And I will give you another example, the issue of rock painting. By default, when you imagine or when you look at an illustration of, for example, Altamira, you always see men painting in the textbooks. So by default, everything is done by men. So to conceive and understand that women or children maybe also did rock painting, this has to be demonstrated with a very powerful science, because as I explained before, prehistory and archaeology are now working with amazing technologies and how with small particles we can determine many other things. So these this is something that we don't work on saying, well, let's see if women hunted or not. What we look into is to creating an inclusive history, or looking into history with an inclusive perspective. So this idea of women going to war or hunting is important. It's something that we need to underline, always based on the harsh scientific data, because these are conceptions or misconceptions in society. So maybe it's not the most relevant information to understand history, but it is relevant to destroy these stereotypes. Maria, of the three references you've mentioned, this guide, handbook, and so on and so forth, maybe you could give us this information so that everyone can have access to them. Thank you. Hello, and thank you so much. First of all, I would like to congratulate you for your presentations. And I would like to comment on something, and my question is for Curt, because I know what we're doing in Spain. So this is linked to this idea of how we have 1 year for the maternal and paternal leave of absence. At the end of the day, I understand the measure, but in some cases it makes sense that we have a delay of 1 year for continuing to access specific tenders and so on, but not always, because sometimes it just slows down our careers and it generates this scissors graph. If the only solution we put in place when we take care of our children is to lengthen this in a year, we will always get there later than men, or especially taking into account that we in general dedicate to this leaves more time, or we are dedicating this to being with our children, and they usually are running and preparing for a marathon. So we need to define measures to reduce the divide instead of increase the divide. In fact, there's some proposals. If we took about assessing 6-year periods, not to increase and not increasing the timeline for women, to say that they have the same average as the previous one. So I know what is happening in Spain, so I would like to know what's the situation in Norway. I don't know if in your university in Norway or at a European level there are any real measures put in place that are not once again punishing women. Thank you.
It's a hard question. It's a hard question because the first 10 years of your career is extremely important for the next 20 years of your career. So we can see that how much people publish at the beginning of their career defines a trajectory for promotions, grants, and new jobs, and whatever. So we have to try for measures that compensate somewhat for this. And I think there are some innovations that are useful. So first of all, anything that measures time must, for example, early career grants, let's say. You're allowed to apply maybe for 8 years after you defend your PhD. That has to not count parental leave. And that can't possibly be controversial, but it has taken some time to get it implemented. And the only real question is, if you have 1 year of parental leave, should we add 1 or should we add 2? Because it takes a little time to get back into it when you get back into your work, when you come back from leave. But there are other things we can do also. So instead of saying, give us your whole list of publications, we can say, give us your 5 best publications. And so we can try to make evaluation. This is all ultimately about evaluation, right? How do we evaluate our colleagues when we're going to hire them, when we're going to accept their article, when we're going to give them a grant? So we can try to make evaluation processes that do not simply reward quantity, because that in the first 10 years of a career is highly likely to be very different for men and women. Now, there are also some decisions that an individual early career woman can make, and we need to support them in making these decisions. For example, what laboratory do you work in? What is the culture of that laboratory? What is the culture of co-authorship in that laboratory? And that is really also really difficult. And there are interesting articles about the dynamics in laboratories of young men just elbowing their way to first authorship, and the women just say, yeah, whatever, I don't care. But it has a big difference. It makes a big difference. And we have to help young men and women early in their careers understand the long-term consequences of those kinds of decisions and try to support them in making wise decisions.
Se nos va el tiempo igual, si hay algo.
Unfortunately, we don't have much time left. We're quite late according to the schedule, but we might have time for one more question. But if there are no more questions, then once again, thank you so much to the speakers for their vision and contributions. Thank you so much.
No.